Welcome back to Mental Health Matters. We got an incredible show for you today and a full house in the studio. You are listening to Mental Health Matters with Dr. Scott Terry. I'm Dr. Scott Terry. And today we're going to be talking politics. But the politics revolving around mental health in the state of Iowa, which is really quite dramatic at this time. And an interesting thing, and we got some great guests. We got three fantastic guests here today. Kurt Hanson, who's been here a couple times before, and so proud and honored at the fantastic work he's doing in this state to try and really make a difference given what's been going on. And we have two other fantastic guests that are about to introduce themselves in a second. But I want to remind everybody that these shows are broadcast Tuesdays at 6:30 p.m. And Thursdays at 12:30 p.m. or in the afternoon on KRUU-FM, 100.1 on your FM dial. And you could listen to them as archives by simply going to the Ardent Counseling website, www.ardentcenter.com, and go to the media tab, and you can look up the shows there, as well as on KRUU-FM. And you could see YouTubes of these shows and all kinds of fun things. Anyways, we're really glad you are with us today, and introduce yourselves, Leanne and Gary.
I'm Gary Oldenburger. I am the Wapello County Attorney.
And I'm Leanne Oldenburger. I'm a talented and gifted teacher for Ottumwa Schools, and I also homeschool, and I'm Gary's wife.
Okay, fantastic. And Kurt?
I'm Representative Kurt Hanson. I live here in Fairfield, and I represent about 30,000 people. Most of those people are in Jefferson County and Van Buren County and Davis County. So I have a wide constituency group with a wide variety of interests here, and very proud to represent rural Iowans.
And a lot of diversity in Jefferson County.
Exactly. Huge. There's a huge diversity in this representative district, which is District 82. So we go from the Missouri border up here to the Keokuk border in northern Jefferson County. So,
and in this area, one of the issues that's become, let's say, contentious lately is the university, or Maharishi University of Management in this specific town, also has a lot of foreign students. So there's a lot of people from a Muslim background. I'm not saying that correctly, but there's different kinds of ethnicities, races, religions, and this community itself pulls in people from across the country. So it might be a small area and might be thought of as a rural district, but in fact, it's rather almost urban in its diversity.
That diversity is what makes this community so strong, and having so many activities that so many people enjoy and visit Fairfield to participate in. So I really appreciate that diversity, and I think it's moving to a stronger community because of the diversity. We don't have that diversity all over rural Iowa, and that's to our advantage and to their disadvantage. So I'm very pleased with the diversity that I represent here in Fairfield.
And I think you make a really great point. Diversity does bring strength, not weakness, not pull us apart. I think in the contentious society we've come to, the us versus them mentality has been incredibly destructive. I know Leanne and Gary, we've talked a little bit about that, and you've seen that.
Right.
Right. I mean, I think people are failing to grasp the fact that, we should be able to gain and enrich our lives from the experiences of other people who are different from us. So rather than separating ourselves from them and saying, well, they're different, I'm not going to have anything to do with them, I think we need to embrace them and say, what do they have that I can learn, and what can I benefit from? And I think that a lot of people are missing that.
And I think so. I mean, I think it goes along with that same kind of thing that I always rail against on these shows, is this all or nothing, black and white, right or wrong, good or bad thinking, which I think becomes a trap, and we paint ourselves into that corner, and we all lose because of that. Our partners are not the other. They're part of who we are. Our families, there's not an us and a them. Our community, even if somebody's different than us, they look at differently than us, they have a different race, ethnicity, religion, gender, that diversity brings us strength, and brings us possibility of how to think and grow. you know? I heard this really great comedian the other day, and he was talking about people in Great Britain. Part of with the whole Brexit thing, there's a lot of people very upset, like, you're not one of us. Go back to your home country, which he's found very amusing, because if you think about Great Britain, they had literally colonized half the planet. And to say to somebody, oh, no, you're not part of us, go away, after what they've created to create such diversity and to create a world where people can grow. I don't know.
Right. And I used to teach at Lincoln in Des Moines, and we had a lot of diversity. And I think even the students were saying there something very similar to what you're saying now, which is, weren't we this initially a country that was embraced by people from all over the world? And now are we trying to say that these new students who are coming into our school shouldn't be welcomed? And at least at Lincoln, I was glad to say that they were welcomed. The students were always welcomed. And, you know, I like teaching in Ottumwa as well. We do see a lot of diversity in Ottumwa as well. And it does enhance and add to the educational fabric of our school. So I appreciate the diversity.
Absolutely. And even intellectual diversity, you know, me and Leanne also come from an educational background. And there's this famous educational psychologist, I think it was just a psychologist, Len Vygotsky, who talked about zone of proximal development and scaffolding, and how essentially brighter students could learn from not as bright students, or more advanced students could learn from less advanced students. And it's a common practice where we could all learn from each other. And that's what we're wanting.
Right. And I think it goes even deeper than that, because I know that because I teach gifted, so I get very nuanced between what's a gifted student versus high ability and what's best for each of the different populations. And there's different groups that work better together than others. But it is important that we have that diversity, because when we have the diversity, the kiddos who are gifted start to realize that they're not necessarily gifted in all areas to be successful. They have areas that they have passions, and that it may not be their gift. And it's okay to develop that passion, even if it's not their gift. And so they can have that and learn from others things that they would never have initially thought to even try to do. And that happens more when there's diversity. If we all think alike, then we're all going to be mathematicians, and that's it.
Well, yes.
I appreciate that thought, because when I talk to high school students, I frequently say, well, there's two very important things in your life, one of which is your IQ, but even more important is your I will. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And people have to have a reason to motivate themselves and so forth. I see so many strengths in diversity, but I also see a lot of fear in the unknown. And so if we don't have that diversity, we generate and strengthen these fears that we have, the fear of the unknown being one of the biggest fears that I think any of us have. And so I really appreciate the diversity in this community and other communities. That's part of maturing intellectually, I think.
Absolutely. So, Kurt, one of the things we want to get to today, among so many things, is talking about embracing that from the legislative perspective. Mm-hmm. And what's been lacking, in terms of wanting to, again, that us versus them, that we don't want diversity. We want just us. We want ways to see things in a certain way, which has direct implications on mental health throughout this state.
Exactly. We have a lot of mental health programs that need to be broadened and strengthened, in my opinion, because we've closed the avenues in many cases due to lack of funds or due to lack of willingness to provide funds for these essential services. I've long advocated for the AAA. We should have mental health that's affordable, accessible, and acceptable. So often we have mental health issues that are closeted in families and so forth until something really overt breaks out, and then there's perhaps a very serious incident that involves law enforcement and so forth. We should have more acceptability of these families to seek professional help and to help that loved one who's suffering from these depressions or these incidences of mental health issues, that they need to be helped. They need to, at the earliest stages, not when they're running around and causing a legal incident.
Well, yeah.
Well, right, and I think, if obviously we deal with this in the legal system where, there are just too many people involved in the legal system with issues that should not have gotten to that level. And even when they reach that point, the resources are not available that they actually need. Every day we have mental health commitments in court. Usually those of people who have made suicidal, thoughts or what have you, but not actually attempted suicide. We had one lady one time who had actually attempted suicide, not just threatened, attempted suicide 6 times in 6 months. And she was, she was put in through a legal commitment. She goes to the hospital for a couple of days. They turn her loose again. What's going to happen a month later? She's going to try again. There's no resource to send her to.
Well, and that's part of this, is creating resources. And this state now has the least amount of hospital beds in the entire country. Iowa, which you think of as such a very progressive state, has the least, the worst availability. I've had several clients that were suicidal that one of my therapists who I train called up the hospital. My client is suicidal. My client is about to kill themselves. And the client goes in and says to the ER, I am suicidal. I'm about to kill myself. And they go, no, you're not. And they go, but I am. No, you're not. And we don't have space for you, so go away. And literally turn them away. And this has happened because there's a lack of resources. And, one of the interesting things we were talking about before is, let me play devil's advocate here. What do I care? Why should I care that there's no beds? Why should I care that there's no resources? Okay, maybe I'm a cold-hearted guy, but why should I care?
I think at the same time we have to realize that there's no free lunches. There's no free rides. And so when the state reduces its budget and its availability of these services, these are pushed down to the county level. And the county level then has to respond. And in many cases, our county level, our frontline first to deal with these problems are our local county sheriffs and our deputies and our police officers. And they're not trained to do this kind of a job, nor do they want this job, but they're forced into it because the state has reduced its resources, and now we're dealing with a county situation where local county taxpayers have to step up, local county boards of supervisors have to step up, and I think that's just an abdication of state responsibility.
Right, and that's true. We end up with far too many people who are being housed in our jail that are there because of, like I said, some form of mental health incident that happened, and the fact that there's not a resource to deal with their mental health issue. And they end up in the jail, and then they're stuck in jail. And again, we're bearing the costs of keeping them in jail, of their medical treatment and so forth while they're in jail. And again, that's all coming down then to the local taxpayers that are having to take care of that because it hasn't been dealt with at the State House.
Okay. And then when it's not even dealt at the local level, right, you still have somebody running around and they cause havoc for that local community, right? We could talk about it from the issue of guns to the issue of psychiatric beds to mental health counselors, and we're going to talk in a few minutes about this bill that's coming up. But, I think it's scary almost to think about, okay, I could just be just for me and think I could have a gated community and this doesn't touch me. But it does. We don't live on an island.
We are certainly part of a larger society, and I think our first duty is to help those people that are least able to help themselves, and that's our young and our aged and our sick and our ill. And I think those responsibilities have been pushed down the scale over the last few years, and there's now a me first type of mentality among many of our citizens. I know the World War II generation was considered the finest generation that ever lived. And I think they were they were more of the philosophy of we're in this for the greater good of all of us. And unfortunately, I think they raised a generation of me first people.
Well, again, so let's say me first is correct. We should only care about us. I'll be devil's advocate here. why doesn't that work? And what you're saying, again, this financial thing, I understand there's political philosophies. Gary, maybe you could address some of that,
Well, again, I think when we reach a place where people are simply pandering to their constituencies and where people are trying to consolidate power, where they're pushing legislation through and taking actions that are based on consolidating their power and satisfying their constituencies rather than what is to the benefit of everyone in our community and everyone in our state. And I think that's you can look at a number of bills that have come, that have been introduced in the legislature this year that are clearly designed to forward an ideological perspective. They're designed to satisfy a certain constituent base that have absolutely nothing to do with benefiting the state as a whole and Iowans as a whole.
Okay. By the way, you're listening to KRUU Mental Health Matters with Dr. Scott Terry, and today we're talking about, I don't know, Kurt, what would you say? How would you phrase?
I think we're talking about the greater good and mental health issues that are affecting all of Iowans and most of the nation. So I think this is not just an Iowa problem. I see it as a national problem, too, where we're talking about reducing the size of government, at the same time trying to service the needs of those people who are in need of mental health services and many other services. So I think we dare not forget that the greater good helps our society move forward.
Absolutely. So, Leanne, you're going to say something?
Well, I was just going to say that I know that in our schools we do have mental health professionals that come in and meet with the students. And my fear is that as we trickle down, that even these kiddos won't get the services they need, especially when we're talking about potentially limiting the licensures and that we'll end up with people who can't help these kiddos. I have some kiddos that I work with that they have things beyond just being gifted or high ability. They've had issues in their family, and they need to talk to someone besides just the gifted teacher on these issues so that they can get the mental health assistance that they need. So then I can do the job that they need me to do to help them in their academics. And so my fear is, as I sit here as a teacher, I'm looking at the union stuff. I'm looking at these voucher plans. I'm looking at all this stuff coming statewide and federal. And I'm saying, where, just like Representative Kurt. Sorry, I always call you by Kurt.
That's fine.
He's so personable.
Yes.
That, like he said, where are we going for these kiddos, for the people who, these kids can't defend themselves. They're not old enough to vote. We need to stand up and say, hey, they need services education-wise, and they need services mental health-wise, and we shouldn't cut them off either.
I think we have to recognize that, particularly in rural Iowa, there's very few of these services available. And one of the things that we're looking for is telemedicine and all of the benefits of that as professionals flee rural areas and congregate in the metro areas for a variety of reasons. But we must remember that Iowa is greatly rural and that we need these services in rural Iowa. Many of our parents here in rural Iowa are working several minimum pay jobs, and their children are in need of services, and unfortunately their cultural activities and their babysitting is primarily in front of a TV set or in electronic games that are held in their hands, and this is not helping them be good citizens and productive citizens for the future. So,
which again costs everybody more money instead of, again, the short term. Everybody's looking at the short term. And, one thing I would say, coming from Chicago, as I have, that what you're describing about rural Iowa is exactly the same as somebody would say about the inner city issues.
We've switched those problems. I remember growing up in Iowa, and we thought of these problems as primarily a Des Moines area or primarily a Cedar Rapids area or Davenport area of concern. And now we're seeing those same issues that were discussed in my teenage years and my early adolescent years as problems in rural Iowa. That has been just kind of a flip.
It has, but it essentially is the same thing that you have, for instance, there is no therapist, no support in, for instance, various parts of Chicago inner city.
Exactly.
And it's the same with certain parts of Des Moines, which has a great amount of therapists, counselors, and other sorts. But in other areas, there's floods. In other areas, there's absolutely no one, and there's no services. And yes, it's easier to drive across that area, but that doesn't mean that's not there. But before we run out of time, Kurt, I wanted to get to a specific bill that's in the works.
All right.
And I want everybody's opinion on this bill. So the bill I'm referring to, how you describe it?
Which bill are you referring to? You're referring to the licensing bill?
Yeah, I was thinking the licensing bill, and but I also was thinking it would be interesting to talk about the gun bill at some point too. Maybe we'll save that for our next show.
That's another big bill. The licensing bill, which is HSB 138, is a very, very large bill. In fact, I think it's 83 pages in length. That just really, really revises a lot of the boards and licensing procedures that have gone on in the past. Looking this bill over, I think it was probably, it looks like it might have been proposed in several different states, so I suspect that maybe it's ALEC inspired, perhaps funded by the Cook brothers, so forth. So I think that this is something that would greatly diminish the ability.
Maybe you could describe the bill, and people should understand that we're not trying to be political as such, of saying we're against the Koch brothers or against ALEC. What we're saying is that having something that's just, I don't know, how would you say this?
Well, I know you're from Illinois,
Yeah.
but we're from Iowa, us three.
Yes.
And we want something that's Iowan. That's what I want. I don't know about, I don't
Yeah.
want to speak for the gentleman, but I don't want something that's just been pushed down in other states and decide that this is for
And it's
Iowa.
from some philosophical agenda that what we're trying to do is get rid of government, get rid of, how would you say that?
Well, I think a lot of it is just designed to, create this vision of smaller government and, reducing the cost of government, and not considering the practical effects that some of those actions take. Again, when you're using a cookie-cutter piece of legislation that some other place wrote and we're just adopting that
Out of philosophical perspective.
Out of a philosophical perspective, and not looking at the practical realities of what are the effects it's actually going to have in Iowa.
So this bill specifically would do what?
Well, it does a lot of things, but it particularly takes out the licensing of many of the professionals and places them into a registry. And I think this is a big scoop of power from the boards of licensing, whether they be medical or education or whatever they might be.
It's from massage therapy to counselors and family therapists and social workers. And
I heard funeral directors.
Funeral morticians are involved as well.
So you would
trainers.
need a license, essentially, not only to practice therapy, which is incredibly dangerous, as some people do practice in this town and in other places. To practice without a license, there are all kinds of implications of not understanding issues, from simple things like confidentiality to developing your skills to knowing what you're actually doing and being held accountable by the state, but also to keep growing. I'm sorry, Leanne, you go.
I was just going to say, as a mom, that's just scary on a personal and a mom level. And I have a son who's had 3 open heart surgeries. The last thing I want is a respiratory tech that isn't licensed. Don't come near my kid. It's just kind of my initial gut visceral reaction.
Or somebody with lesser qualifications that simply was filling that position because the local hospital or something did not have anybody on staff with those qualifications.
And they can save money.
Yes, they can save money. Well, we're talking EMTs. We're talking a whole bunch of different groups of people and different highly trained, highly educated people that would be affected in their professions by this bill. This bill also includes electricians and plumbers as well. It's kind of a one thing fits all. It's just a huge, huge bill that needs to be completely rewritten. It needs an amendment that starts from scratch, in my opinion.
I agree.
Yeah, I would also.
Okay, so the point of this, I'm just sitting here, my head's still spinning. I'm it's one thing for somebody to not get the difference between an unlicensed therapist or counselor, a licensed counselor. I mean, I have trouble people understanding the difference, but being having a doctorate and being a supervisor and and being a much higher level, people seem to not understand the differences between what a psychiatrist is, what a psychologist, what a family therapist. There's no even distinction between those gradations, let alone between being licensed and unlicensed and having no qualifications because you're not licensed. You're not part of. Anyways.
Well, and I think there are a lot of other ethical and legal implications as well. I mean, this opens up an opportunity for people who just do not have the training, do not have the ability to do these things in a safe and effective manner, to open up their own shop and get people to come in and see their services. Just like we see a lot of times, in mental health services, people who cannot access those resources self-medicate, by finding street drugs or some other source of illegal prescription drugs. People who do not have access to a licensed person are going to go to the unlicensed person who could do them infinitely more harm than good. And then, we don't have the legal restrictions as far as not having sexual relationships with your clients or any of those kind of restrictions or protections would not be available to their clients.
I'm glad you brought that up because in the old days there were unlicensed and unmanaged professions that were fronts for illegal activities and so forth. That's what brought about many of the restrictions and licensing procedures that Iowa has, was the abuse of the unlicensed people that were claiming to be professional people.
So in our final minute here, if somebody's actually interested in saying something, having their opinion, and I think this is the time in life that we need to start speaking up. Representative Hanson, how would you suggest people say something, do something?
I think the first and foremost thing would be to call or go to the public forums that representatives and senators have. Speak up face to face. This is the best way. Visit the Capitol, call them out of their chambers, and talk to them about your concerns. Whether you're a constituent of theirs or whether you're on a distant district, speak up and state your mind and say, this is the reason that I think this is bad for Iowa and Iowans.
And are you allowed to do that? Go ahead.
I was just going to say, does it help? Because I know, Representative Hanson, you're on our side on this. Does it help for them to just call you so you can say, I have 500 constituents that have been flooding my line?
That helps, very much so. But at the same time, you get 107 emails or something on one little subject, and it's important to those people, but many of those people are outside your district. So you listen with both ears to people in your district. You probably listen with only one ear to people outside your district.
Okay, but so you find out there's sources to find out who actually is your representative, because some people might not know who their state representatives are. But this is also true on a federal level as well, right? So stand up, go to the meetings with the senator, email, call the senators, call the Congress people, but also locally do this. We have to do this locally, not just nationally.
And these are local issues we're talking about today.
All right. Well, thank you so much for all of you for being here today. And, the suggestion that you guys seem to be making is if you want something to change, do something about it. Don't grumble to your neighbor, but make a phone call.
Democracy is not a spectator sport.
Absolutely. That's a great way to end this. Anyways, any last words by anybody?
No, I love his saying. I love democracy is not a spectator sport.
Absolutely. Thank you all to you, Gary, Leanne, Kurt Hanson. Thank you so much. Bye. 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 Bye.